Good morning. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us on today's webinar. Our topic for today's webinar is Regional Behavior Support Review Committee. Today in the studio, I have Rhiannon Evans, who is the statewide Tier Supports Coordinator. Also joining us today, we will have Melantha Witherspoon, who's the Eastern Area Behavior Analyst, and also joining us will be Lucas Evans, the Central Area Behavior Analyst. A few housekeeping items before we get started today. If you have questions regarding today's content, we ask that you put those in the Q&A box. If you have questions regarding some technical aspects, if your sound's going in and out or something like that, I will do my best to help you with those. But if you'll put those in the chat box, that'll help us differentiate from content and the technical questions. There are also a handful of polling questions today, and those polling questions will show up on the slide. I'll also open those polling features up, so be watching for those. We'll get started with several of those, so I'll try to gauge enough time to allow you to answer those. We do ask that everyone participate in those, especially since the first ones give us a better idea of our audience that's participating. So, with that said, I am going to turn it over to today's presenters.
Hi everybody, my name is Rhi Evans. I am a committee member on the Central Regional Behavior Support Review Committee and also will be a committee member on the Southern Regional Behavior Support Review Committee once we have that one up and going. So our goals and objectives for today, you guys will be able to understand the purpose and the process for the Regional Behavior Support Review Committee. You'll know the selection criteria for the individuals and the behavior support plans and ISPs that we review, and then know kind of what are some of the outcomes that we're seeing from the review committee. So to get started, we're curious, have you heard of the Regional Behavior Support Review Committee prior to this webinar? Yes or no? All right, so it looks like a lot of you have heard of the review committee before.
Some of you aren't answering.
Some have not answered. That's okay. We'll go on to the next polling question. So if you've heard of the Regional Behavior Support Review Committee, have you participated in one before, either as a committee member or having your plan reviewed?
All right, so the results look pretty consistent with the previous question. So it looks like most of you that responded have not participated. So this is going to be a really good presentation for you all today to learn about what the committee's about, some of the good work the committee's been doing, some of the effects it's been having, and then also how to get involved in that process.
All right, so the next polling question before we get started is, what is your primary job role? So if you don't fall within one of these roles of support coordinator, guardian, behavior analyst, provider, or therapist, just choose other for us and maybe put in the chat box what your role would be if you're in the other category.
This question is just to kind of help us know who's in the audience. So ideally, everybody all the different roles that are listed could participate in the meeting, but we're just trying to make sure that we know if there's a particular group who isn't aware of the committee, that we can do some outreach efforts.
All right, so it looks like we have a lot of others, and most of those fall under state employees, so QE, due process committee chair, PR leads, CLC. Can you go back? And then after that, we have quite a few support coordinators on board.
And a few behavior analysts, so good.
Yeah.
All right, so what are the goals? So what is the purpose? Why do we do the Behavior Support Review Committee? And the reason why it was begun was to start trying to increase the amount of consultation we're able to provide teams around behavior services, to ensure that they meet best practices, to ensure that the supports that are in place are ethical and that are following the ethical guidelines, and to ensure, so not only are the supports ethical, but that they're least restrictive as well. So that means that they're justified and that only the amount of restrictiveness necessary to ensure successful supports are the ones being used. And then to look at what's in place in the plan. So a key thing to think about as we walk through this is that the committee process is primarily a review of written documentation of the individual support plan, of the behavior support plan. So these are plan reviews. And we'll talk a little bit about that more, but recognize that we're talking about what's written in documentation. And so what we want to look at as well is, so if these supports that are written down in documentation were to be implemented correctly and completely, would that actually increase the person's independence and enhance their quality of life? And then all of this builds to ensure that we're meeting those Medicaid waiver assurances that are a necessary component of Medicaid waiver funding. So again, I kind of already talked about that, but specific items for Medicaid waiver assurances is that we are reviewing any ISP or behavior support plan that includes the use of a prohibited practice or timeout. Just a quick note that if timeout has not previously been approved, so it was approved before it was being used, it would be considered a prohibited practice. So we have to review all of those ISPs and BSPs that have those items in it. And then we also want to prioritize for review those people that are experiencing the highest level of risk to make sure that they have the opportunity to get some help. And we'll talk about what those risk areas are in a few slides. Oh, yes, thank you, Rhiannon. Could you step back? Other prohibited practices that we're reviewing. So I talked about non-approved timeout being a prohibited practice. Other things that are considered prohibited include enclosed cribs, the use of mechanical restraints, and then a new one that people may or may not be aware of is when you're using locked doors to keep people in. So if you're using door locks to keep a person in as the primary purpose, that would be considered a mechanical restraint, and we would need to review that quickly and eliminate that practice as soon as possible. And then also, if calling law enforcement is your standard practice, that's the go-to thing that you do every time you get into a challenging situation, that also falls under prohibited practice, and that would also need to be reviewed. So in regards to promoting best practices, so what we want, I'm being told that my voice is not carrying, so hopefully this helps everybody able to hear me. Is that better? Bob says it's better. So we want to establish standards for what a review looks like. So what that means is that we have a standardized checklist that we use to look at individual support plans and behavior support plans. And so we have this consistent review tool that we use to ensure that items that are present in either the ISP or the BSP meet best practice standards. And then we want to make sure that we're doing the review process itself in a consistent and systematic manner. So we have consistency across what the review looks like, but we also have consistency across the actual process of the committee.
And the process for the review committee is we have a chairperson who is a licensed behavior analyst, area behavior analyst for the state. They receive the plan, redact the plan, send that out to committee members. The committee scores the plan using those checklists Lucas talked about and submits it back to the chairperson. And then the committee gets together to talk about discrepancies. We calculate our inter-observer agreement score. We have a goal of having at least 80% agreement on where the plan, how the plan scores.
And then to continue in that line of promoting best practices, we want to make sure that the supports that are in place comply with ethical guidelines. Those of you who here that are behavior analysts, you should be familiar with the BACB's compliance code, which lays out the requirement for things to be least restrictive and effective treatment. We also want to make recommendations to the team, including behavior service providers, based on established standards and practices. So this could be a lot of different areas. So this might be, if you're a behavior analyst, the task list. It could be published research. If you're not a behavior analyst and you're a clinician of another sort, that's additionally published literature, licensure law. Again, whether you're licensed as a behavior analyst or a counselor, you're still held to a standard based on what your licensure says. Home and community-based settings rule is relevant for everybody because it's the overarching framework by which we provide Medicaid waiver services, and it must be followed. And if you're not familiar with what HCBS requires, it would be a very, very good idea to refresh yourself on things like least restrictive supports as laid out in the plan, documentation, all that stuff is really, really important. General person-centered philosophy, getting some additional training on what that looks like, and then implementation science, which basically is the practice of looking at how we actually put supports in place and maintain them over time. So all those things are really, really important and are the kind of themes or categories of recommendations that we would make. So here's how we kind of find out who we want to invite to the Regional Behavior Support Behavior Support Review Committee. And so I think a key word here in the title is invitation. So I think it's really important for us to recognize that this is for the most part a voluntary process. So we prioritize these folks that I'm talking about on this slide for invitation. They can say no. Those people that experience prohibited practice are not voluntary. So that would be one situation in which the committee review would not be a voluntary review. These folks, these high-risk individuals, are voluntary. So we would invite them. We think it's a good idea. We hope that you agree it's a good idea by the end of this presentation, but it's not something that they have to do. It's not compliance. So high-risk people are defined as those that meet at least one of these categories here. Surely we probably can have some agreement that folks that are encountering law enforcement or going to the psych hospital or going to the ER for behavioral crisis or being restrained or getting in lots of fights are kind of high-risk situations for a person to get involved in. And so if a person has one or more of those categories, we would consider them a high-risk individual and we would prioritize them for invitation. Now, those people that have some risk but a little bit less are those people that have lots of staffing and lots of medication. So the way we look at this is if you have a lot of staffing, it's probably because there are problems bubbling up that need to be addressed, but you're not quite yet at crisis. Now, we could probably debate on whether that's true or not, but just in general, looking at the number of folks that we support. Same thing with medications. If you're using a lot of medications, that's probably indicating there's some problems bubbling up that are being kind of suppressed by a lot of medication. And when I say a lot, I mean 5 or more psychotropics in the last 90 days. So 5 medications, psychiatric medications to treat something, some constellation of psychiatric problems. That's a lot of meds. And then one thing that we're looking at trying to figure out how we fit in the future is when people move. So anytime people move, that's an increased risk. Even if it's for a good reason, it's extremely stressful, and we want to make sure that we are recognizing and noticing and keeping track of people that make placement changes.
Okay, so other ways to be involved. Lucas talked about prohibited practices, that being not voluntary for attendance if you are implementing a prohibited practice. And then also self-referral, and Heike here will pull up our self-referral checklist so you can kind of see what that looks like. So if you're really struggling with an individual and you need a little extra support or some outside advice, then you can fill out this self-referral form and submit it to the regional office.
It won't have all of that track changes things on that. Sorry about that.
And this will be available to everyone after the webinar is over on the website.
Okay, next slide. Do you want to do this one?
Yeah.
Go for it.
So the next polling question, Lucas talked a lot about who our Tier 3 folks are. So again, that would be law enforcement involvement, psychiatric crisis, emergency procedures, frequent physical altercations. So we just want to know, do you currently support people who are within that Tier 3 category? And if so, is it less than 5, 5 to 10, or more than 10 folks?
Sure. So looking at this, again, of the people that responded, a good majority of you support at least one person who would be considered a Tier 3 person. So I would argue, or I would put it out there that I think all of you who support at least one person who's a Tier 3 could benefit from the Regional Behavior Support Review Committee process. So who makes up the Behavior Support Review Committee? So the chairperson is a licensed behavior analyst employed and appointed by the Department of Mental Health. Currently what that means is the 3 area behavior analysts that work under the chief behavior analyst, who's Dr. Terry Rogers. So currently there are 3 chair people in the state, one of which is myself, Lucas Evans, for the Central Region. There's Melantha Witherspoon for the Eastern Region and Southern Region committees. And then there is Rita Cooper, who is in the West. And we currently operate 3 full-time committees. And the committee is comprised of behavioral service providers from that region. So what we mean by behavior service providers, we mean people that are licensed to practice applied behavior analysis or provide behavior therapy under contract with Department of Mental Health prior to the Missouri licensure law, so those people that were grandfathered in, or students who are working towards becoming board certified at either the full behavior analyst level or the assistant behavior analyst level with direct supervision by a licensed behavior analyst. Other people that might participate as necessary might be a nurse or a quality assurance quality assurance personnel if there's some specific issues, further review that would benefit from their expertise. Why peer review? Well, it's a really good way to try to arrive at a solution that potentially you didn't necessarily see at first. So one of the things that is helpful is to brainstorm with other folks around difficult situations. And if you're a behavior analyst and you're familiar with your compliance code, you'll notice that one of the requirements, one of our obligations as board certified behavior analysts is that we seek out and participate in professional peer review. So it meets that specification as well. I would imagine that other professional ethical codes have similar statements about professional peer review. And then one of the additional benefits of peer review, other than it helps you figure out the answers or strategy changes or things to do differently in challenging situations, is that it actually reduces your liability by involving outside expertise. So your liability for a situation is decreased by involving outside experts. And then finally, it provides you an opportunity to network and get support from people in your community. So if you're a behavior analyst, sometimes it can be a really lonely job out there providing individual behavior services with not a lot of contact with other behavior analysts. Here's a way to come in, get some help from other behavior analysts in your community, get some networking, and then get some help. And then what we want to do as part of the Behavior Support Review Committee is provide ongoing education to behavior service providers. So this is one of our major components or major goals of doing professional peer review through the Behavior Support Review Committee, is we want to continue to train behavior service providers in areas that they might benefit. So that might be ethics, that might be effective and evidence-based strategies, that might be references to best practice standards for our field, it might be around ways to analyze or collect data, and then it might also be introducing people to newer or relevant research that might be helpful to their specific situation.
And how we do this is by asking questions, talking about concerns that we see in the behavior support plan or in the ISP, discussing current progress or issues going on, and then offering suggestions and constructive and positive feedback. We really want this to be a positive experience for anyone that comes through the committee.
Yes, thank you. Good point. To continue with our theme of being change agents that provide training to folks, so at the level of the support coordinator, the families, the guardians, the residential agencies that support people, we want to provide training around medication. We want to provide training around individual support strategies. We want to call notice to and talk about rights limitations and restrictive interventions. So one of the things that sometimes comes up is our limitations of rights that weren't really recognized to be such, and then ways in which those things can be successfully addressed. So it might be absolutely justified in the moment, but what's your path towards not needing it? And one of those paths towards not needing it might be behavior analytics services. So we are behavior analysts, we run a committee, sometimes we recommend behavior services. But I don't want people to walk away from this thinking that, oh yeah, that's the place you go to get the stump speech about why behavior analysis is everything and for everybody. That's not really what we're trying to be about. So we don't just recommend behavior services, though we do recommend it a lot because we think it's usually pretty helpful when you have behavior problems. So you get behavior experts involved when you have behavior problems. That makes sense. But we also make recommendations for medical consultation, for medication consultation with psychiatry, occupational therapy. I mean, we're really just looking at anything that could be potentially helpful for a situation, for a person. And so that's really what we're aiming for.
So really the common goal here is for continual development of effective, universal, preventative and proactive strategies, as well as skills to recognize when higher level supports should be added to those universal strategies.
we recommend that the entire team attend the meeting, so the person that's being supported should attend, the service coordinator, the person's guardian, home manager, the direct care professional that is supporting the person. If they have contracted behavioral services, that the behavioral service provider should attend. If there is a licensed professional counselor working with the person, we want the whole entire team at the meeting participating, sharing information, and learning new information as well. The meeting is also open to service coordinators, supervisors, the general public. We just have people sign a confidentiality form saying that they will not share what was discussed in the meeting. Sometimes directors of the regional office participate, as well as chairs of due process and our quality assurance nurses. Teams that attend will receive clinical consultation regarding strategies for support. We also, because we're reviewing the behavior support plan and ISP, those documents sometimes include rights restrictions, so referrals can be made to due process if all of the components for due process are not met. We recommend sometimes that people need a higher level of service, so behavioral services is recommended. In applied behavior analysis, our first step is to make sure that a person is not experiencing medical issues, so we may refer the team to seek support from a physician, as well as other services such as counseling and looking at a person's quality of life, whether that's pre-employment services or a day program or an individualized schedule. So earlier in the presentation, it was discussed that the area behavior analysts pull high-risk data, and so approximately 171 plans have been reviewed, and based on the high-risk data that was pulled, of the 170-something plans that were reviewed, most of those folks fell into approximately 2.5, 3 categories prior to being reviewed by the Regional Behavior Support Review Committee. After being reviewed, there was approximately 66% reduction, which clearly shows that in most cases, participating in the Regional Behavior Support Review Committee is beneficial. People are actually getting something from that. There was also a survey sent out to see how teams felt about participating, as well as getting information to see if people had heard about the Regional Behavior Support Review Committee. And those who participated in Regional Behavior Support Review Committee, a little under half found that it was helpful. And so this is another set of data that shows that it's good to participate in the Regional Behavior Support Review Committee. Again, the overall goal of the Regional Behavior Support Review Committee is to make sure that in our ISPs or in our behavior support plans that we are using the most effective and ethical strategies, and also finding trends and addressing those trends when the most effective strategies and ethical issues are coming up so that we can address them. So we want to be a support. Again, we are using data to make decisions, and so looking at those 170-something plans and looking at the elements based on the checklist, reviewing the ISPs, we learned that only about 30% of them included positive support strategies. 30% of them had a teaching component. 15% had justification for restrictions, and then almost 100% of the plans included restrictive interventions. And so our goal is to make sure that all of our plans have lots of proactive supports and strategies, that skill deficits are identified, and there's lots of teaching to address those skill deficits. And there are times in which restrictions are needed for a time, are needed, and they should be time limited in most cases. But we want to make sure that we have justification in every ISP and behavior support plan if there are restrictions in it. So this data just illustrates the need for peer review in areas that need to be addressed. This is the data that was collected based on the behavior support plans that we reviewed. It really mirrors the data of the ISP. Again, our goal is to make sure that we're using the most effective strategies based on the science of applied behavior analysis. And so this just illustrates that we have additional work to do to make sure that our interventions are based off of the function of the behaviors that are identified, and that our strategies align with the function, and that there is teaching. And so, again, this just illustrates the need for peer review. And then this graph here breaks down the percentage of elements that we're going to attempt to focus on and address in the trainings that we're going to give contracted behavioral providers. As you can see, that there was not a lot of plans that we reviewed that had visual analysis of data, which is a requirement. Again, 25% of the plans only had teaching in it. Again, the goal is 100%, and behavioral services are time limited, and so people don't have them for their entire life. So we want to make sure that the strategies that are outlined in the behavior support plan generalize across environments, and so we have to make sure that our plans are written in a way so that once the behavior provider leaves, the person remains stable. So again, we're going to focus on making sure that we are addressing these elements so that people are receiving the best quality of services that's needed. There are currently 3 committees. There's the Western Committee that is chaired by Rita Cooper. There's a Central Committee that is chaired by Lucas Evans, and I am Alantha Witherspoon, and I chair the Eastern Committee. Each committee meets once a month. The Western Committee meets on the 3rd Tuesday of every month in the afternoon, and the Central Committee meets on the 3rd Friday in the morning, and the Eastern Committee meets on the 2nd Tuesday of every month in the afternoon. You don't have to live in a specific region to participate in that committee. You can just reach out to either myself, Lucas, or Rita, and let us know that you are working with a person who's experiencing any of those Tier 3 or Tier 2 outcomes, and you would like some additional support.
And the meetings last about 45 minutes, and you can either attend in person or by phone. So like Melantha said, you don't have to be living in that area to attend. You could call in by phone. All right, so the rest of the time will be if you guys have any questions for us, just go ahead and pop those in the chat box, or the Q&A box, I'm sorry. All right, so Steve is asking if there is another way to be added to the member list other than emailing the regional LBA. And Steve, could you maybe put in there, are you wanting to know be added as a committee member or to come through for your plan to be reviewed?
So, Steve, there's a training that is going to come up in the month of June, and if you can make sure that you send your information in the chat box, I will make sure that you get the information about the training so the information can be sent to Jefferson City and you can be a part of the training for the Regional Behavior Support Review Committee.
And then we have another question. Should a crisis safety plan be completed first before contacting the review committee?
Having a crisis plan completed first is a great idea, but I would not allow that to prevent me from contacting the committee. The committee can definitely give you feedback on the crisis safety plan if it's already done, and if not, we'll recommend it to get done. So.
All right, if there are any other questions, we'll give you 2 more minutes to get those in before we log off for the day. Thank you. All right, thank you guys very much for joining us today. After this is over, the recorded webinar, the materials we talked about, so a copy of our checklist as well as the self-referral form will all be available on the webinar page on the website. Did I miss anything?
We'll also send out an email.
Oh, we'll also send out an email blast with that information, so you can look for that in your inbox.